It's a pleasure to have been participating in this webinar series. I want to thank a couple people first before I introduce Chris. First of all, thank you to Kelly Maroney, who's done a great job keeping us all organized and setting everything up for this. Thank you to Lori Cleary and her husband Jim for hosting it. They serve as the hosts for these Zooms every week. And also thank you to the Clearys from Argus for all they do to help us with our website and some of our other marketing. This has been a great series, as Kelly mentioned. We've had some really great programs. We kicked this off as part of Evergreen Park Chamber of Commerce Week. The reason why we were doing this program is, as we all know, we can all use some help, some marketing help, especially during the pandemic where things are very different. It's a way for us to educate our members on some new techniques. It's also a way for us to promote members who are in that field. Each of the people that have been on this series are members of the chamber, and so it's our way to help them, and they've been just wonderful programs. So today we're very happy to have Chris Lanuti. He has a very extensive background. He actually moved to Evergreen Park in 2006. In 2008, he was part of the Cook County Sheriff's Police as a 911 dispatcher. He became the union's president in 2 years, was promoted in 2014, and then he was a midnight supervisor of one of the largest counties in the country. He left that position because of medical reasons, and he started the Broadcast Basement Limited in Evergreen Park. After 10 years of running a podcast as a hobby, and seeing that podcasts rank as the Stitcher top one to find audience-specific podcasts that could provide advertisers with targeted customers. And now his Broadcast Basement is turning a monthly profit behind 9 other podcasts on the network, including the EP podcast and Socks in the Basement. You can probably hear Chris regularly with his EP podcast, and he's done a great job with it about his background before that, which got him to this point. So Chris is a broadcast journalism. He has a broadcast journalism degree from the University of Illinois, and after that, he started working at WPGU FM in Champaign-Urbana, which was a commercial radio station that hired students to work alongside of broadcast professionals. In 1998, he was the youngest #1 rated morning radio host in America at the young age of 19. He remained in that spot until he moved into Wheeling, West Virginia, the Pittsburgh market in 2000, and there he was the #1 morning radio host with listeners 12 years and older. And then he went on to different morning radio stints in Nevada and California before returning to Chicago. So you can see Chris is very experienced in this field, and you can tell when you hear him that he's very excited about his work and he has a passion for it. So we're very happy to introduce Chris Lanuti. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate it. So that was very nice of Laura to run through everything that I've done. You know, I do the EP podcast as part of the larger Broadcast Basement On Demand Radio Network, and the idea behind, I'm sorry, was somebody saying something? I'm terrible at these. Okay, the idea behind the network was to try to find ways to put together a podcast that could actually make profit. Most podcasts don't make profit. If you're not Joe Rogan, if you're not Adam Carolla, if you don't have a million plus listeners, you just don't make any profit on your podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts all over the place, but with very broad topics, you have a very difficult time of reaching a specific audience that anybody will want to advertise with. So the idea was to try to come up with ways to bring specific groups to people. Hence the EP podcast that brings you Evergreen Park listeners and the immediate surrounding area, or Socks in the Basement, which is the other very successful one on the network, which brings you White Sox fans. And the best way to describe what a White Sox fan is what was told to me by the owner of Red Wing Shoes, who signed a 6-month contract with us about a month ago. He said, I want to start getting blue-collar workers, and those are White Sox fans. So, and he told me that. Now, that's what I was probably going to tell him, but he knew in his mind, like that's what his picture of a White Sox fan was. And he can advertise with me at a far lower cost than advertising with the White Sox. or NBC Sports or any of the other entities that are going to charge the same rates that you would get from TV and radio and print across the entire city. And we have the #1 White Sox podcast, the most downloads according to the Internet Advertising Bureau, the IAB. We're going to have 100,000 individual household downloads in 2020 on that show. In comparison with the second best podcast, which is put on by NBC Sports, we have 8 listeners, every one of theirs right now. And we're doing it from my basement. So the idea behind the broadcast basement was to find very targeted things, never stray from what your podcast is about, and just specifically talk about what you're there's no reason for me to talk politics on my sports show. There's no reason for me to talk sports on the EP podcast. The idea is you want your listener to be into what they clicked on and get the content that they're expecting from that click. So I'm going to do my only share screen, and this is my first time running a Zoom call, so good luck to me. I'm going to try to bring up, here we go. I think that everybody can see this. This is our sales sheet, just to kind of give you an example of some things that we talk about with people when we're talking about the EP podcast or any of our other podcasts, but it tells you an awful lot about podcasting. 75% of podcast listeners take action on a sponsored message, according to NPR. Podcast listeners make it through 90% of a given episode, and they relatively don't skip through the ads. One of the reasons behind that is that a person listening to a podcast has made the conscious decision to say, I want to listen to this specific show. And in their mind, they've taken time to do it. Much like if somebody were to use a Netflix show and they'd be like, I'm going to sit down and binge 3 episodes of Stranger Things. Like, they made a decision, this is what they're going to do. It's not on in the background like radio. With TV, especially on live television, there's ads. You get up, you run and go do something, you fast forward through the ads. You've been preconditioned to the idea that with those things, you can skip around and you can leave them. But this is more like your on-demand media. So that's why people, when they do it, when they're listening to it, they've made a choice to listen to the whole thing. They've actually taken the time. They don't have to do it on the podcast time. They do it on their own time. And so we get a much more captive audience. Podcast listeners are more engaged than radio, TV, and internet users, with 90% of them listening to all advertisement. 67% are able to recite a feature or promotion in the ads unaided. And a great example of this is if you were on this call right beforehand, there was already talk about different things that we're doing on the podcast, including the thing that we're doing with Open Outcry with the crossover. John Brandt from Open Outcry, that's a business relationship that we have. I love his beer. We've hung out. I've done things with him where one takes care of the other, but he pays for spots on the EP podcast in the effort to promote his business in the Evergreen Park. He made a decision 6 months ago that he told me about, that he wanted the Evergreen Park market. And so his way of getting the Evergreen Park market was to advertise on the EP podcast. His thing was, I want to be able to talk about my beer. I want to be able to talk about my restaurant. I want to be able to talk about what I'm doing in the community. I want people to get to know me, and I can do that a lot easier through a podcast and make a more personal connection than I can do with any other type of advertisement. By comparison, 7.3% of readers, according to Midroll, will actually retain or be able to recite something in an ad later on after they read it. 34% of TV viewers and 43% of radio listeners. 61% of podcast listeners have made a purchase due to a podcast advertisement. Think about that. When you're trying to find rate of return on your advertisements, that's a big number. Their connection to the host, I become the person that's endorsing the ad. And I'm very aware of that because of my time in radio, because there were plenty of times when I was young, I took the money and later was like, what the heck did I just endorse? And I was embarrassed by, like, I was endorsing this restaurant or endorsing this product, because at the time it was like, just read this ad. And I take that very personally. So I think it comes across when I read the ads, because people can hear it in your voice. It's not something you can hide. And so that's one of the reasons why podcast listeners will make purchases. The average Chicago radio commercial is $362 per commercial, according to Gabler.com, which monitors media across all different towns. You can basically punch in any kind of town on that website, and they'll tell you This is what the standard rate is for advertising. And they cost about $1,000 for them to produce. The average internet radio advertisement, or I'm sorry, the average internet advertisement, let's talk about your Facebook. If you have an ad on there, some way that you're doing internet advertising, it's $2.15 per click-through. We're 17 cents per complete download. And so we're able to, as a podcast, we're able to provide something that in new media that other media is not able to keep up with right now. And so that's the basics of it. That's my pitch, but I'm not going to do that for you. I wanted to bring up those other stats. So the EP podcast and Sox in the Basement and the Broadcast Basement Limited is capitalizing right now on the fact that, and I'm going to turn off this screen share, is capitalizing on the fact that right now more and more people are finding podcasts. You go back just 10 years ago, it was 3 to 4% of Americans had listened to or heard of a podcast. In fact, podcasting has got such a silly beginning. It's called podcast because of Apple Podcast, or because of Apple, because of the iPod. So Apple comes up with the iPod and you can download songs. So ex-radio people, or people that want to break away from their radio stations, or those that wanted to get out whatever message they wanted to get out, instead of uploading music to iTunes for sale, started uploading podcasts. It was completely made by people who took advantage of the iPod and Apple system. And Apple hated it, but they couldn't regulate it because there were too many people that were downloading things. So they just slowly accepted it. And now only recently, with the boom in podcasts, we're into the 30%, maybe approaching 40% of Americans have heard of a podcast, listen to podcasts. Now everybody's trying to do it. Google has now switched their entire Google Music thing and split it into Google Music and Google Podcasts. Spotify has spent millions of dollars to be able to change themselves into being a more podcast-friendly site. There are podcast markets everywhere. You have iHeartRadio, you have Stitcher Radio, you have them starting to show up in cars. Chevy has an agreement with Stitcher where on a lot of their newer vehicles, when you click on the touchpad, you get your radio station pops up as a possibility. You can click on Stitcher and listen to podcasts. So, and it's right there in your console. The other thing about podcasts is they're mobile. You can carry it around in your device. They're a lot easier. They drive radio stations nuts. Radio's so afraid of podcasting right now that they're trying to start their own podcast. And the hardest thing that they have is that they have people that are doing their radio shows that then they just take the recorded radio show and put it in podcast form. And the problem with that is when you watch something on demand, do you really want to sit down? You're planning out your own personal time. Do you really want to sit down and listen to a 3-hour radio show? You're going to get very tired of it, which is another reason why all of our podcasts go for about 30 minutes. Because we did an awful lot of research to try to figure out what's the average listening time for somebody and when will they get tired of it and turn it off. And our idea is to get through the ad, because if we get through the ad, we get the download. Where our stats are certified third party, and they don't double count if you're in the same house. They don't double count if you use the same router. If Kelly decides that she wants to listen to the EP podcast in the car, and somebody else in her household is listening to the EP podcast at home, and they're using the same Apple Podcast account, it counts as one listener. So our numbers are just deadened constantly because they're just run through the ringer. And so the idea of doing short, quick podcasts is a good thing because our numbers would be lower if we couldn't get people through the show. So there's a lot of science behind it. It's a new thing. It's something that there's a lot of trial and error. I don't think most people have caught on to the way to make money that I think we figured out over here. I have radio guys who call me up in Chicago and they say this is. I know there's been conversations about me in WGN, and there's been conversations about me in at Q101 already from people that are in there where it comes up like, why aren't we doing this? So I think I'm going to get copied a lot. I can already kind of see it on the White Sox podcast landscape. A lot of the White Sox podcasts are starting to change the way they do their shows because they're like, whatever he's doing is working. We're not sure exactly how he's doing it. But that's a little background on podcast and how they work and how I set up podcast. Right now, the company also does podcasts for businesses that want to start their own. We have a life insurance company, Elite Benefits of America, that's just recently started a podcast with us based here in Evergreen Park, Butch Zemar. We did the Little Sleep Show for a while for Laura Meyercourt. She had Nest Family Sleep. She just took a position with a much bigger company, and they told her she couldn't keep doing her podcast. So she's on hold because she's trying to find a way to get it back on. But there are some businesses that are thinking of, could I do a podcast just for my business that explains, they find something that's targeted that could drive people back to my business. A great example of this would be, it used to be that somebody would try to figure out, how do I buy a house, let's say. How do I buy a house? I've never bought a house. I'm 20 years old. How do I buy a house? I can go ask Dad. I can start searching it on Google. Now, one of the new things that people will do is they'll say, I bet you there's a podcast on how to buy houses. And they'll search it just in a regular search engine in a podcast thing, and they'll get a list of different podcasts that tell you how to buy houses. And I guarantee most of them are being run by real estate agencies that sit there and explain the whole process, but it's a big giant ad for their company. They also show it on their website so that when they're getting first-time home buyers, they can sit there and say, if you want to know more about this, we do a podcast, check this out. It could be used as a supplemental thing. It could be used as something that actually brings in customers. And so, we were approached by other companies. That's the funny thing about it. Everybody that does a podcast with us right now that does it for their business reached out to me. I have not actively tried to sell it, but it's becoming a thing that businesses are saying, if I did my own podcast, I could not only strengthen my company, but I can get more listeners, or I can get more clients. I can also help those that are interested in working with me, kind of push them through the process. Like you're teaching them. And so that's become like a big thing that a lot of people are trying to do. So I really like that one. I like that whole, that concept. It's kind of an interesting one for me. It's something that we've just kind of gotten into over here. But the idea that a business can sit there and supplement what they're doing and be able to show people, like, this is what we do. This is how we do it. So that's another thing that podcasts can do. I'll tell you a little bit about the popularity of podcasts right now. I've been asked now by several high schools to come on and speak. Every single one of them that I've spoken to, I've done a few Zoom calls here during the last, I would say, during the pandemic, and I actually did some in person last school year. Every single time I was reached out to by a teacher, I didn't know the teacher ahead of time. They had hunted me down in some way because they had heard my show, and they had somebody from a local television station like NBC or WGN. They had somebody from a radio station. They had somebody from print media, and the kids all said, we want a podcast. Podcasting is becoming the medium for the next generation. If you're a teenager or if you're in your 20s, you're getting an awful lot of your news and information through podcast. It really is the next wave. And it makes sense when you think about Netflix and Amazon Prime and how we watch our TV. Now we're getting our audio through podcast. And we don't have to. Podcasts right now don't run 5 minutes of commercials in the middle of the show. It wouldn't work. So you're not getting inundated with ads. You're getting specifically what you want to talk about. If you hate the host, you just go find something else that talks about the subject that you want. You get to pick, any viewpoint that you want. The amount of political podcasts out there is incredible. And they have the weirdest fluctuation in listeners, because you might sit there and think the host is like, great, you're completely on with his political beliefs. And then the moment he says something wrong, the person goes, done with that. There's somebody else that's right around the corner that I can go to. That's what podcasting is. So it's important to stay on message when you're doing it, but it's also a great thing because people are searching out specific things that they want to listen to. And if you can get your message out in front of them, it's only good for you. To go back real quick to what some of these kids in these high schools will ask me, a lot of them want to know how to start one. A lot of them, I've sat in these forums where they ask for questions at the end, and the guy from the radio gets 2, and the young lady from the TV station gets 2 or 3, and I spend a half, because it's such a new medium and it's what they're excited about. They love the idea, younger people, especially those that are going into media, love the idea of being able to create their own content and be in charge of it.
Thank you.
And it's only going to make podcasting grow. So it's going to grow on a big level, What we do is on a small level. And what probably makes most sense for those of you in the Chamber of Commerce is either finding a way to target people through other people's podcasts, like the EP podcast or Sax in the Basement, or if there's something that you think targets a specific group that you're trying to bring into your business, or you want to use podcasting to find those that you can draw into your business. So that's one of the things that we can definitely talk about if anybody has any questions. I kind of want to pause. I feel like there's different things that I can talk about today, and I don't want to leave a point and not give people a chance to ask any questions. So if there's anybody who has any questions on what I've gone over at this point, I would love to hear them. Awkward silence. So
I have a question.
Sure.
What about like material for like, you know, like, cause I mean, there is like various businesses, you know, and I mean, you make it sound so easy that a business could come and, you know, make a podcast, but I just am always curious, like, do you help them with like the material then, you know, like?
Yeah. So the best example is the podcast that Elite Benefits of America is doing right now, because he's just started. So Butch Zemar doesn't have any equipment. Laura Meyercourt decided to go get hers. Butch doesn't have a lot of equipment, so he just asked if he could use the studio, which is fine. So he comes in and uses the studio. But with him and Laura, I give consulting notes. So I try to so he runs into roadblocks a lot. Like if you listen to his show, you don't hear the 20 minutes that he sits there and he goes, I don't know what to say next. And I'll sit there and say, well, what do you want to say? And then I kind of lead him through like how to do it. I mean, there's no substitute for, as you know, as Laura said at the beginning of it, there's no substitute for nearly 10 years getting up in the morning and doing 5 hours of morning radio 5 days a week. It would be impossible for somebody, unless you are a born natural, to be able to jump on and do it and make it sound the way that I make it sound.
Right.
What I do when I produce shows for people is I do an awful lot of editing to try to make it that way. Butch says the word every third word. You don't hear it in the show because I take it out. So I add music in the background. I cut out the things that don't make any sense. When he repeats himself, I snip it. So the idea is that I clean his podcast up for the purpose of making it sound as professional as possible. And then I talk to him about things like, you know, you should tell more personal stories. You know, he will sit there and talk about insurance. And I think the first time he did one, he goes, well, client A did this, and then such and such did this. And he was using these very technical terms. And I said, you need to change that into, so Joe comes into the office and he wants to do this. And Mary says, well, you should do, and and tell it as a story. So the next time he came back, he was more prepared to be able to do that. So there's a lot of tricks to the trade as to how to engage listeners and get them to listen to you. One is, I mean, from everything to content to, I will tell people sometimes take a pause, you know, slow down how you talk. People draw into you more when you slow down and talk slower, leave a pause. It makes their ears change. So there are things that I try to teach those that I do podcasts for and try to explain it to them. You know, nobody expects anybody to be perfect when they start one, but yeah, there as far as content is concerned, it's amazing how much content he's able to come up with when he wasn't sure if he would have enough, because there's so many different things he can get into. You know, he did the history of insurance the other day. I was captivated by it. I mean, I'm producing it because he's paying me, but I was like, really? That's where health insurance came from? Like, I had no clue. I was like, that's amazing. It was like a half hour of like, this is how insurance came to the United States. That like, he went through like how the Affordable Care Act is literally the framework that Nixon put ahead right before Watergate, and then it fell apart, and he uses all these citations, and I was like, and how where HMOs came from, and I got to the end of it, and I was like, I understand more about insurance than I've ever understood in my entire life. Like, I mean, and from all the complaining over the last 10 years about, you know, Obamacare's bad or Obamacare's good, I know more about it in 30 minutes with him. And I was like, that was a great show. I told him, I said, that should be your number one show. We're going to change the orders of the show. And when people find your podcast, the first show they should listen to is the history of insurance. So we're changing that on his thing so that if somebody discovers the show, then we know where it goes. So, I mean, like those are the kind of things that you're surprised at the content that you have, but there's content that's out there.
Very good. So, thank you.
No problem. If there's no other questions, I'll kind of get into a little bit of marketing with the podcast and what I've been doing, especially when it comes to new outside ways to kind of try to figure out how to get your message out. With podcasting, you're talking about a very specific thing and you're getting out your message, and those that are on the podcast can find different ways to do it. So what we do, some of the things that we do, first of all, just on our show, we have an interview segment that we run, and not all of our interviews are paid interviews, but I have one paid interview spot a month, or a show. And there are some people who have taken advantage of it in the community and they love it. What we do is we just sit down and we talk about their business. We try to make it as entertaining as possible. We try to make it sound less like an ad than it could, as little of an ad that it can sound like, while still getting across the things that they want to get across. I've gotten good reviews off of them mostly, to the point where John Brand over at Open Outcry signed for a year. He does 2 of them a month. He loves them. He says that he's gotten response inside of his business, and he can see it. We just did one for the First National Bank of Evergreen Park. They're a sponsor. They put their symbol up on the podcast logo, and which is great. In fact, I probably have a picture here. I'll share my screen real quick if you haven't seen it before. All right, so this is the Apple Podcast view when you go on the desktop. But the First National Bank of Evergreen Park has their logo on the front of the podcast, which is great because all podcast players show the logo. And so if you're looking on your phone or anything like that, it pops up. The other cool thing that they have is they have a link inside of our feed. So depending on the podcast players, some of them will actually carry the link onto their podcast player. Some of them will not carry the link over. But like if you're using it through the Podbean app or through the website, or I want to say that Spotify has the link that works in there as well. There's a link to their business sitting inside of our show description. So if somebody's listening to the show, the link is there. It takes them to the page. So right now they're going to a specific one for the EP podcast that they're running a thing where they're running a thing this month where they're trying to promote everything. Last month, this took you to student checking, and the month before it took you got $300 for opening up an account with them. So the other thing was, so they do it that way. We have people that run just regular traditional ads. We have people that want to run ads that I almost give like a dry read, where I talk about them in the middle of conversation, but I make sure that I hit the things that they wanted to hit. So there's a lot of different ways that we do things. We also try to find ways to bring our businesses more foot traffic. So right now we're offering the EP Podcast Car Magnet over at the First National Bank of Evergreen Park. And it was a good fit for them right now to do that. And we might expand that to other people. But right now we're doing it with them because they have a drive-through. And during COVID, it allows people to pick up the car magnet as they drive through their drive-through lane, or they can go inside the business. Danny Roselle over there is the assistant manager and is in charge of their marketing, called me up on Tuesday and wanted to thank me for the amount of people he had walk inside of his bank over the 48 hours after the show came out. That my tellers were we didn't even have the magnets next to the tellers, and now they have a setup for when people come through because everybody's driving by to get the magnets. Now, what's great about the magnets is that it drives foot traffic to Danny. It also acts as a nice little billboard in the back of every bumper in Evergreen Park for the EP podcast. And those are the kind of things that I try to do, because when I used to do radio, you heard what Laura said. I mean, the towns I was in was Champaign, Illinois, the Wheeling, West Virginia, Pittsburgh market. We were in Wheeling broadcasting in the Pittsburgh. And I'm going to take this off here real quick. We were in Wheeling and we broadcasted in the Pittsburgh. We did not have a very good budget. And I see Butch Zemar's in. So we were just talking about Butch. I see him, he popped in, which is awesome. Butch, I was just talking about you with your podcasting and how I help you with doing your show. So we might have to ask him more about that if he wants to talk later. He's on mute. So, but that's something that I would have to do. In small markets, there wasn't a big budget. I was in Reno, Nevada, was probably the one that had the most amount of money. It's a beautiful studio, and there was nothing but money in a gambling town. Bakersfield, California was a bigger market. It was right outside of LA, but they didn't have very good budgeting. So I used to have to do things all the time to bring attention to my business or my morning show where I didn't have a budget. So I learned things like the whole magnet thing from radio. That's an idea of, okay, I go out and I purchase the bumper stickers or the magnets, and I find a way where people get something off of it. But if you think about the fact that I'm going to give away a $50 gift card this week to somebody with the magnet, and then you equate that and put that up against, I could run $50 in ads on Facebook. Which one do you think probably gets me more attention? And it's the person, and it's the people who sit there and say, I see your magnets all over town. It's the reminder to people that other people are listening to the show. It's the idea that if somebody else likes this thing so much they put it on the back of their car, then obviously it's worth me listening to. And it's the idea of building, you're building amongst your listeners or amongst your customers the idea that you're not something that they want to miss, that they want to be there. They want to go there because others are going there. And I think that goes back to advertisements. I mean, when I run ads for restaurants right now or bars, one of the things that I will hear from bar owners or restaurant owners is that people will come walking in and say things like that they came because they heard about the special on the podcast, or they came because they had heard somebody else talk about it. It starts to become a thing where you can't miss it. You can't miss going there.
No.
The best example is Untitled Restaurant on 96th Street. Untitled Restaurant was a brand new restaurant. They were not doing very well early on in terms of getting people through the door. It became a thing where they would tell us all the time that they became something that they would tell us all the time that they were getting foot traffic because of the podcast. And they would have people that would sit there and say, well, this is the hot place. That's what I hear. Well, it's a hot place. That's what they hear because Sal was buying a live read ad where he was coming on talking about his business, or I was showing up there, or we were doing an interview with the chef, or we were doing a tasting contest. And like, that was something that we were doing to make it seem like it was a hot place. And then we were running ads to remind people that, hey, don't forget about Unidad. So a lot of the things that we'll do with advertisers that we'll sit there is we'll say, okay, fine, we're gonna have you on and make you a person. We're going to talk about your business. We're going to give you a chance to really connect with people. We're going to make sure we surround that with ads so we remind people that you exist. And then you create something over time where in the person's subconscious, like this is the new hot hip place to be. And so that's the goal, I think, whenever you're doing marketing with any company, is to try to make yourself top of mind. To try to make yourself something where if somebody goes, I need to go buy insurance, there's that one spot. I always hear it. Where's that place where I go buy insurance? Okay, I need to go to a real estate agent. There's that one spot. I hear about it all the time. Where's that place where I always hear that they have real estate? What's that local place all the time? I've heard him talk about this before. It's time to go out and take the kids out to eat. Where's that spot that talks about where they eat all the time? That commercial or that thing. Marketing to me and advertising to me and getting your business going to me is trying to make sure that people think that it's the place. I've done that with the EP podcast, for example, with the fact that we do other advertising. I will run Facebook ads. I will run contests where it doesn't cost a lot of money, where things go viral. We will do again this year our Halloween kids contest. I will purposely ask people, I will have people call in, say, tell me all about your kids and their costumes, show me pictures of your kids' costumes, and one of them is going to win $100 or a gift card to something we're going to do. And what's going to happen is we're going to put out the finalists, and we're going to put out 6 or 7 finalists, and their mothers are going to lose their minds sharing it across Facebook. It is going to be on every page, and I am not going to have to pay for it. It's going to be everywhere because they want their kid to win. I can go back and find the week in my statistics that shows me when I did that contest and shows me the increase in listeners specifically from getting something to go viral. So a lot of what I talk about podcasting, I'm going to tell you right now, personal pitch to you. I get into people's heads and people remember the message that we put through with the EP podcast. But then there's other things that I do that any business can do where it comes to trying to find a way to get things to go viral and share them. And that Halloween costume thing is a big thing that we do every year. We try to find certain things that we know will go across social media. I do a specific billboard. I do a bus board campaign, but I only do it specifically at certain times of the year where I know that I'm going to get the most traffic in that area where it's going to make sense. And I do it at the same time that I do the magnets, because I couldn't do the magnets and the magnet contest and the billboards at the exact same time for 12 months a year. The investment would be crazy. It would make no sense. But if I hit it hard for 3 months, when it goes away, the magnets will still be sitting on people's cars. And the idea that the EP podcast, I see that billboard all the time. I see these magnets. I got to check this thing out. I got to make sure I listen. I haven't heard the latest episode. There's buzz about it. Somebody brings it up. It continues to bring in listeners. And it's the reason why, even when we aren't marketing, we continue to see a rise in our listeners. We're a mountain that never dips. And the reason for that is that you can hit it hard with marketing and with advertising, get into people's heads and take a break for a couple of months, or take it back down a notch and ride the wave that you created when you saturated things. And that was something I would do all the times in radio. Saturate like crazy. We would have specific months where I would be like, we're going to duct tape my stunt guy to a light post over the busiest intersection that there is. I am going to do some kind of other stunt that's going to get me TV time, because if I did something crazy, it would show up on the morning news in a small town. Okay. But also we would throw in, that's when we throw our actual marketing budget in. I didn't like to spread things out. I like to hit it really hard and then kind of take it down a little bit. When you start getting results, you start getting more of a budget. So the idea for me was always hit it as hard as you can, find a bunch of different ways to get into people's minds, scale your budget down a little bit. You'll start to get people riding that wave. You'll start to see more customers. You'll start to see more money. And now you could bring the budget back up again when you're doing marketing. So that's how I've always done things when I'm trying to do it. But it's more than just running a commercial, so for me at least. And for my advertisers, more than just running one ad for 1 month. It's doing it for 3 or 4 months. It's mixing up the ads. It's doing the live interviews. It's having us out at different locations. It's backing it up with social media. It's the fact that, look, perfect example. We talked about it before we even turned on the Zoom call. John Brand at Open Outcry is not in Evergreen Park. He's at 109th and Western. He draws an incredible amount of people from Evergreen Park. It is a market that he pulls. And if you thought about what's the brewery of Evergreen Park right now, it's not Horse Thief that's closer. It's Open Outcry. He shows up at every event that the chamber can do. He's at the library sip and sample, giving them free beer. Okay. He does the EP podcast, and then he links in with me where he goes, well, I'm going to put these 4 sheds up on top of my roof, and I want the EP podcast to have one of the sheds. So he's giving me advertising by the fact that everybody that eats in his place for the next 6 months will sit in a room that has all of my podcasts in it, because I'm going to put up Socks in the Basement and the EP podcast and everything else. But then he's putting that up on his page. So I'm sharing it. So now he's getting even more free advertising from me that he didn't pay for because I'm sharing it. He's sharing my stuff. The amount of extra things that happen because we're working together and trying to, he's very, very good at, he does 3 or 4 different things at once. And that's an important thing. But back to podcasting, and I know I ramble a lot when I do these things, and I normally can edit myself afterwards. I think that podcasting is a great alternate media that shows incredible results that may not be part of your marketing plan right now. And if you're looking for another way to add into marketing, especially in an inexpensive way, I think our ads run at the lowest $25 for a segment sponsorship a week. And our most expensive one is that 5 to 10 minute interview. It's $150. And we have mid-commercial ads of $75 a week. And we have this rotating ad at the front that's like $115. And when you think about the amount of listeners, there's 7,000 households in Evergreen Park. We're going to have 35,000 individual household downloads complete that they got through the whole show. Not counting people who only listen for a little bit, not counting if a husband and wife both listen in the same home. 35,000 in 2020. So, you hear things like buy a billboard and this many people drive by it. How many people actually saw it? I use it as a supplemental thing for my marketing because it's not something that captivates an audience. A podcast it's something that is an appointment. when they're listening, they're thinking about it. They're into the ads. They're into what the host is talking about. They're into the interviews. And it's also something that if you decide to do with your business or your own company and you decide to make your own podcast, it's another way to keep your potential customers or your current customers involved with you, where you become something that is just secondhand to them. If they need to go to you for anything, they always think of you. And I know that Butch Zemar, who's on the call, and we were talking about his, where he's doing the one for Elite Benefits of America, the Zemar podcast that we just started up with him. He's already thinking to himself, okay, I can do this and this helps my business. Now, what products can I talk about in insurance? Or what people can I get to advertise on my podcast, which is its own advertisement for my business, to not only pay for the podcast that I'm doing, so it's costing me nothing, but maybe even give me a secondary income stream that comes in or add to my marketing budget. So it actually can be a money-making thing for a business depending on the material that they have. And if they think that they have already somebody, could be like, if your business deals with other vendors and those vendors would want to get in front of the people that you already deal with, now all of a sudden you have somebody that's going to supplement the cost of you doing your podcast. So for businesses starting their own, there's all kinds of potential for it. And for those that want to change their marketing and want to broaden the people that they're getting to and want to be top of mind, where they're getting their message embedded into people, and they can do it in a lot of different clever ways, where sometimes it doesn't even sound like an ad. Advertising on a podcast, especially local ones like the one that I'm doing, they are another way to look at marketing your business. So I know we're getting close to the end, and I literally have nothing else to say, Kelly. So I would love it if somebody had a question, and it could be any question. Colleen Klimzak is raising her hand. Hello, Colleen. Colleen has talked about doing a podcast for her own company yet. I'm still waiting for her.
We have, yeah. So honestly, like, you've talked about content, which is really helpful, and I have that. You talk about, I have the things to say. My concern, and I know that I can just start with you, and that's awesome. You already, like I said, we did have that conversation. Mine is the logistics. Like, so I was actually texting Butch while you were talking about Butch. Hi, Butch. And like, I went to go and find his podcast, but I didn't know the name. How do you get, who do you list with? Where does it live?
Right.
Who hosts it, I guess, is the question. I'm thinking of it, I guess, in my like website terms. But so that technical part of it, could you talk?
How do you get people to find you?
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. So first off, with hosting it, you would find a site that actually hosts podcasts. There's a couple of them that are very reputable. The top two are Libsyn and Podbean. I use Podbean because it actually uses IAB certified stats. And if I'm going to sell commercials, I want to be able to say this is exactly 100% verified and takes things out. So I use Podbean. What Podbean does then is it not only gives me a website that is a landing place for my podcast, which of course you could just point your site to it. It allows me to have embeddable players, not only for the podcast as a whole. So if you just put it on your website, an embeddable player, when people went there, the latest episode would be there with a list of other episodes. But then it also, you can embed specific ones. It will set up things where it automatically shares to social media. And it also provides you with an RSS feed. And they've gotten very good now at being user-friendly. When I was doing it, even 2 years ago, I had to go to every single thing from Google to Alexa to Apple Podcasts, whatever, and submit each one of them individually. It was like a 20-minute process. Now, it's with a click of a button, and they'll show you right on the screen. This is how you submit to Google Play. Do this, copy and paste this into this line here. You'll get an email in three or 4 days. It's going to tell you you've been accepted. Then take that and punch that code that they give you into this, and you're linked up. And every time your show comes up, now it's on that app and Apple Podcasts, everything else. It tells you what your dimensions for your art should be. It tells you, and it also allows you to put in keywords for searching. So when you Google White Sox podcast, every once in a while it doesn't show up as the top one, but very often Sox in the Basement shows up as the top one because I'm terrible at like Google, like trying to figure out like how to get me searchable. But just by putting in the keywords, like I could put keywords into my podcast. I could put keywords into each individual podcast. I have specific keywords that are in the show as a whole, shows descriptions, what categories it falls underneath. So all these podcast providers are going to ask things like, what category is your podcast? So you'd be surprised that you go and you want to look up podcast on, and I honestly believe, I always go back to real estate because I believe there's actually a real estate category on Apple. So you can click on it and there's actually like enough podcasts. They have their own I think they have their own category. If they don't, I know there's different business categories that things fall underneath where you can put it in. So you can categorize your podcast, and then you share it through social media. You build your audience. That's essentially what you do. You're going to build your audience around those people that you already know are going to come to it, and you're going to build it through your social media, and you're going to make it shareable. One of the greatest ways to make your podcast grow is to have on guests that have social media presence that are going to say, listen to me on this podcast. Honest to goodness, it's what grew every single podcast that I did. In Evergreen Park, I grew the EP podcast not only by all the marketing and being at different things, but when the mayor was on the first time, the village emailed out a link. It was a big deal. Okay, I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It was a big deal. You could see it. It was the biggest show at the time that we had, and we just kept growing after that. So getting people on with the Sox in the Basement one, I think the first one, I had Jason Benetti on, who's the broadcaster for the White Sox. I was able to talk to a friend that got him on. He came on. He tweeted it. He's got 20,000 followers. Thing takes off. So, I mean, and it grows as you're doing that. So guests are a very good way of marketing your show because you get this very organic way in which the show gets shared. But as for listings, people look up things in categories. Another great trick that you can do, you try to get on the trending podcast. I've never seen this happen, but I've had an awful lot of podcasters tell me that if you make your first 5 shows or first 10 shows and you don't release them at all, and you release them all at once, if it trends, it'll show up on the top of like the Apple page for suggestions for a day. But I think that that's kind of a hit or miss thing, honest to goodness, because I've experimented with it and I've never seen it happen. So I think the more tried and true thing is a little bit of patience and a little bit of using guests, using social media, using your own website, sending it out to people that you think would already be interested in the topic, and eventually it spreads. So is there anybody else with a question? I'm trying to think of anything else that I could think of for when it comes to podcasting. But essentially what you're doing is you're creating something, you're creating content for potential customers. If you're creating your own podcast, you're creating content for potential customers and for customer retention. And there is something in there where you would be possibly able to, depending on how you want to do it, you might be able to find vendors or other people that want the audience you have that would pay for the cost of your podcast or move it up, or actually pay you, like you will actually make money on it. And the same thing for if you decide you want to advertise on podcasts, what you're doing is you're looking for specific audiences and understanding that you're getting a very captive audience when you advertise on a podcast. Nothing against other things, but I'm going to tell you something right now. I haven't had a flyer dropped off on my door from the guy who does the flyers, and he was a very nice guy. I don't even remember his name, but he hasn't dropped one off since the EP podcast got going. And and my understanding was that several of my advertisers, he came in, they told him he was on the EP podcast, he threw his hands up and walked out the door. So it was getting results that he wasn't getting. So and it's a shame. I feel bad for him. He was a nice guy, but we give a very good price, and we really target our listeners, and we get palpable results by they feel that they have people coming in because of the show. They get people say, I heard you on the podcast, and that's something that you don't get from most other types of advertisement.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah.
I was kind of amazed at those numbers you put up on how your listeners respond to ads and different happenings. And I know for a fact that when you put out something that's kind of got an urgency to it, like food drives or sending or buying those signs that the Evergreen people put out to support people, that really gets action, it seems like.
Yeah, it does. And we've been fortunate. I mean, that's another way that you know, when I was on the radio, I always thought I sucked. Like, that's the honest thing. I mean, I would do it and I would come out and be number one, and I would tell my producer, this is a mistake. Arbitron screwed up the books. I am not that funny. I don't get this at all. I was always waiting for the next book to come out and be like, he's in 12th place. Like, I never believed it when it was happening. I never really got the advertising angle of things, and I never really believed that anybody was listening to any. I mean, like, the nice thing about the podcast thing is that it shows me the numbers. It also shows me like on a holiday, like, nobody listens and they don't listen till Tuesday. But that Monday, like, at first when I was doing it, I was like, everybody stop listening to the EP podcast. Like, I lost all my listeners. And then Tuesday, everybody would go to work and it would go back up again. I'm like, oh, thank God. But one of the things that kind of helps me measure that things are going well is what you just said, is that we do, when we have a call to action or something like that, we see, we'll get calls back from people that say we need help with the food pantry, or we need help with this, or we need to help with this. We'll be like, we got people who said that they heard it. And so that's another nice thing that we get. The other thing is the fact that, like, I'll give you a little secret. The EP podcast grew. It nearly doubled its numbers because of COVID-19. Like, everybody else hates COVID-19, and COVID-19 is terrible, and it killed my advertising. I lost 80% of my advertisers because they were closed, and I totally understand it. And most of them, I forgave their bills. I was like, whatever, don't worry about it. I mean, we're all getting killed here. I understand, but the amount of local listeners that wanted to know what was going on in Evergreen Park, we were growing every month and doing very well and selling, but the amount of people that wanted to hear from the mayor, the amount of people that wanted to know what was happening and then stuck with the show afterwards, we really became kind of a fabric of Evergreen Park during COVID, because our numbers just shot up like crazy. And so, I mean, and that goes back to what I said, is that if you have something that's super interesting that people, that targets a specific audience, you get a very captive audience, and they return for it.
Hey, Chris, one other question, if you can.
Sure.
Do you ever run into problems with copyright deals with when you rebroadcast something, or?
So I'm fortunate that when I was in radio that I bought a music library. It actually was gifted to me, but I had the copyrights from it from a record label that was sucking up to me for something, and I wanted my own music library that I could use. So all the music that I run in the background, I own, or I have permission for. So I don't run in any copyrights because of that. Technically, when we do cover songs and we're screwing around and we're singing like a popular song, we could get in trouble for it. But I go back to the old radio adage of, do it until somebody says, what are you doing, and yells at you, and then you go, whoops, I didn't know. But I mean, I also know that when you did that in radio, or when you did, and you would get a cease and desist, and if you just desisted, you were done. I mean, so I don't worry about doing those things, because first of all, they're terrible versions of their songs, and who would take the time to come after the EP podcast for covering a White Snake song? I mean, I don't think that anybody cares.
Come on, Chris, you're a big deal. Hey, but isn't there royalty-free type music that could be done for those who are doing it on their own?
There's royalty-free music. There's lots of websites where you can get your own royalty-free music. And if I needed to do it, I would go and get that. I actually use a song for when John Brand comes on, where they sing a pitcher of beer sometimes in the background. That's a royalty-free song that I found. Where I went on the website, I just Googled royalty-free songs, and then I went onto a site and Googled like beer songs and found one, and I downloaded it, and it's royalty-free, and I'm able to use it. So yes, there are sites where you can get royalty-free materials where you can use them. Butch's intro and outro is actually from some guy from Britain that really wants to make it big and doesn't care if I mention him, because he just hopes that somebody will say, "What's that song?" And he sends me his music by email all the time because he found the podcast network. So I actually took something like 10 seconds of it and looped it to where it's like a 40-second intro, because the rest of the song is so terrible. So that's something that I'm able to get away with too. So Is there any more? Otherwise, I think I made it to my hour, Kelly. You know, and
Thank,
I guess the only other thing that I would say is that, like, if you're a business and you're curious more about this and you want to talk more about it, my door is always open, and I have no problem sitting down and talking with people about what they want to do with their podcast and kind of explaining the whole process in detail for them if they want to do their own or if they want to advertise on the EP podcast. I mean, I have no problem doing it. I'm right now in a very comfortable position where I would say 6 months ago, it was funny. I went into Durbin's. Thank you, Kelly. I owe you for that one. I went into Durbin's yesterday, and I used to go in and have to like nail the sale right there. I was like, okay, I'm going to tell them about it. I'm going to get them to sign. Now what I do is I go in and I tell them about it, and I tell them, and we don't have any commercial inventory for like a month or so. But if you want to do it, let me know. So there's plenty of time if you want to sit down and talk about the idea of running ads on the EP podcast, or if you want to run them on Socks in the Basement. And we could always sit down and talk about if you want to start your own podcast and the good and the bad and the pitfalls and whether or not you think you have enough content.
very good. Thank you, Chris. We really enjoyed the program. It was very informative. And as I mentioned earlier, we can all tell you that you have a passion for what you do, which is very exciting. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us and educate us all on this great marketing concept. I want to also just again say thank you to everybody who's helped out with these programs. Thank you to Kelly, who always works with the chamber very well. She's a blessing to us because we all have to run our own businesses, and she is concentrated on the chamber. Thank you to our current president, Laura Freeman, with Berkshire Hathaway Byros Realtors, who stepped up to take on the leadership role this year, not knowing that we were going to have a very unusual year with COVID. And thank you to the Clearys, Lori and Jim Cleary from Argus, who do a wonderful job helping us with our website and other things, and who are the hosts of this program. So we have one more program, and it's actually going to feature next week the Clearys, who are going to talk about websites, Google marketing, and email marketing. So please, if you haven't registered, please do that. We want to conclude with a bang, but all of our programs have been great, and we thank all of our members.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right, everybody, have a good afternoon. Hope to see
Hey,
you next week.
Chris, I threw this on in light of you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My team at least won a playoff game.
But I do have a Sox one hanging up over there. So yeah, it depends on who's in the room.
Which has to come to my basement and record amongst all this White Sox members.
But I will not enter the basement with a Cubs jersey, at least not yet.
All right.
All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks, Laura and Kelly and Lori. I appreciate it.
You
Do you need
bet.
me,
Okay, thank you very much.
do you need me to give you this meeting back, or should I just end it?
You're going to send it. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care, guys.